Hi, good morning everybody. So today we're going to be going over the bandsaw. So right here is the bandsaw and a few different parts on the bandsaw. Here is our on-off switch. So green is on, red is off. These may look a little different on a few different machines. Here is our wheels. Here are our wheels that our blade runs along. So once you turn the machine on, it turns the wheels on, which moves the blade around and around. So the blade is actually one big circle, and it's continuous. The blade can get popped off the track, and if that ever happens, just make sure to shut the machine off immediately, and we will get the blade back on track. To know if the blade came off the track, you'd still hear the machine running, but the blade would not be moving. And if your piece is in the blade, leave it, shut the machine off, and we'll get it figured out. Okay, here's our blade guard. So this guards the excess blade that we're not using based on the thickness of our material. Back here is actually a wheel that you can loosen and tighten to adjust the blade guard height. And then this here is your table. So whenever you're cutting a piece of material, you'll always make sure your piece is flat on the table while being cut. And then of course right here is your blade. And then the red area around the blade, you never ever want your fingers to land in that red area. That means you are way too close to the blade. So those are the general parts of the bandsaw, and we'll start going through our safety rules. So your first safety rule is that the upper blade guide should be 1/4 inch above your workpiece. So what that means is your workpiece, when it's flat on the table, there's about a 1/4 inch gap between your piece and the top of the blade guard. This leaves enough room for you to work your piece through the blade, but it also protects you by guarding that blade, so that way there's not an excess amount of blade here. Because if we were to have an excess amount of blade, that leaves more risk for an injury, because right now then all this blade is exposed, and if I was going through here and slipped, I would run into the blade versus running into the blade guard. So we want that about a 1/4 inch above our material. If you're struggling right now to visualize a 1/4 inch, it's about the thickness of a pencil. So you could simply just make sure a pencil fits in between there. If you're too much, move it down. If you're too little, move it up. Okay, second safety rule is to never place hands or fingers on the cut line. So what the cut line is the cut line is where you will be cutting. So if we are cutting this curve here, when we go to cut it, we're never going to have our fingers, our hands on the cut line when moving our material through the blade. We want to make sure that we're off to the side. So if we get focused on following that line, nothing is on that line to where we'll injure ourselves. Everything would be off the line. So wherever you're cutting should always be marked, and you never want your fingers or hands to be placed on that cut line, also known as the line you are going to be cutting. Do not back out of long cuts while the blade is running. So if we were to be making this cut here, number one, we should be making relief cuts, which I will get into in a minute. Number two, we do not want to cut till about this point and then back our blade out of our material. What can happen is the blade can get cut as it's being pulled out, or can get caught as it's being pulled out, which will cause the blade to get pulled off the track. So if you ever cut into a long cut like this and you're stuck and you don't know where to go, simply hold on to your material and shut the machine off. Wait for the blade to get done moving before we try to pull our piece out of the blade. If you pull excessively hard, you could just snap the blade in half. So make sure if you need to back out of a long cut, the machine is shut off, and then you wait for it to come to a complete stop. Next safety rule is to keep 2 inches between the blade and your hands. This is really important, and this comes back to this red zone right here. So you always want to make sure you're keeping a sufficient amount of space between the blade and your fingers. 2 inches is the rule on the bandsaw. If you come within that 2 inches, you're simply way too close to the blade and there's too high of a risk for injury. Next one is to use relief cuts with about 1 inch spacing on long straight cuts and curved cuts. So if we come back to this curve here, relief cuts are used to relieve the tension on the blade as it's making a cut. So if we were to make relief cuts here, first, if we were to cut out this curve, first we're gonna cut these relief cuts. So these are really short cuts, so we can cut in and come back out with the blade running because they are short cuts. So first we would make these 3 relief cuts. So that way, when we come to cut the curve, these chunks are flaking off, which is leaving 0 tension on the blade. Because if we were to create this curve without relief cuts, our blade is going to get twisted and start to bend, which is going to cause the machine to sound a little funny, and which also may snap the blade or want to twist your material. So relief cuts are really important, and you want to use about 1 inch spacing. You don't have to use an excessive amount because simply then you're just wasting time. So use about 1 inch spacing, and you want to do it all along curved cuts as well as long straight cuts. The next one is do not force the work into the blade, guide the work slowly. So we want to make sure that when we're using the bandsaw, we have a good stance and we're guiding the work into the blade. If you're pushing really excessively and you slip, number one, you're going to slip into the blade. If you're pushing really excessively, usually that means there's something else going on, like a dull blade, the wrong blade for the thickness of material, maybe your blade guard is down too far to where you're running into that blade guard. So if you catch yourself pushing excessively hard, stop, look over the machine, and let's problem solve together to see what needs to be done. So simply the blade should cut the material rather easily, especially the material we're using in this class. And you just simply want to guide it slowly, and it should cut pretty easily. So if you have questions on the bandsaw, be sure to let me know.